Good afternoon, everyone. A warm welcome to all of you who are joining us for the inaugural Payments Study Report launch. My name is Linley Donnelly from the South African Reserve Bank, and I have the privilege of being your program director for today. We have with us today policymakers, fellow regulators, and of course, players in the payments ecosystem. So we extend a warm welcome to all of you, and we really do hope that you get particular benefit from the insights and the research that we'll be sharing today. Just before we begin with the really good stuff, there are just a few notes I'd like to take you through. We've had some last-minute changes to the agenda. Unfortunately, Tim Masela, the head of our National Payment System Department, is delayed. His flight was delayed back into South Africa, so he's unable to join us today. However, we do have our Deputy Governor, Dr. Cassim, who has very kindly agreed to step into Tim's shoes this afternoon. The session is being recorded and it will be made available on our website along with all the report and press materials should you need it to access it after the event. And we will obviously have our Q&A session a little bit after the keynote remarks from our DG. Our esteemed panel today includes, as I said, DG Cassim. He is the SARB's, leads the SARB's Market and International Cluster, which includes the Financial Markets Department, the International Economic Relations and Policy Department, our Legal Department, and of course, the National Payment System Department. We also have Mavis Matwana. Mavis is the Divisional Manager for Business Support in the National Payment System Department, and Mavis led the cross-functional team that delivered on today's research along with our research partner. We are also joined by Dr. James McAndrews, an economist who's consulting to central banks and international agencies around the world. Previously, Dr. McAndrews was the Executive Vice President and Head of Research and Statistics Group at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And finally, we have with us Mr. Jan Weergelen. He is the lead researcher for the payments study that we'll be launching today. He has been a research practitioner for the last 30 years and comes with a wealth of experience in social, economic, and behavioral sciences research. So we welcome and encourage questions from the floor during our Q&A. However, if you are feeling a little bit shy, we do also have the option to use Slido. So you can just scan the QR codes that are supplied on each of your tables should you wish to submit some questions to our panelists. But again, please, we do welcome questions from the floor. Now, as most of you gathered in the room today know, the payments system threads through our entire economy and touches the lives of almost everyone, perhaps not in the same way as it does when you interact with a physical banknote or a coin. However, as our Governor Lesetja Kganyago said at our very recent SARB AGM, all too often payment systems are considered the boring plumbing of the work that a central bank does. However, with rapid innovations in financial technology, payment systems globally are becoming instead central to innovation. They are enabling more digital transaction channels, they are reducing the reliance on cash, and they are providing new ways to drive financial inclusion. As our study today will show, the payment system is also a wealth and a store of knowledge. It can give us insights into the choices that consumers are making about what they pay for, what they use to pay for those things, and why they are buying what they buy. So, let's get down to the business of today. I'd like to now welcome on stage our DG. He will share his remarks on how the study was conceptualized, how other countries have utilized similar work as this, and what he makes of the initial results. DG Cassim, over to you.
Thank you, Linley. We've had so many events here that I hope I have the right notes for the right event. But I spent 7 years as the chief economist of the Reserve Bank before I became deputy governor. And I spent those 7 years in profound ignorance. As I was the chief economist, the payments department kept on coming to me and saying, we'd like to get you involved in payments. I said, don't waste my time. It's such an irrelevant thing. It's not macroeconomics. And little did I realize in my capacity as deputy governor, in whatever direction I go, any facet of central banking, of my international work, it's the payments issue. It's the industry to be in. And if you're not in this industry, I feel the rest of the world very sorry. So let me just say, I have a very few introductory remarks just to share with you. It's really the inaugural payment study we're launching. And it's really an attempt by the SARB to provide a public good, which a central bank should do in a variety of areas, and this is one of those. So, this initiative is really to better understand the payment landscape in South Africa. It supports our current strategy, Vision 2025, which identified a need for the SARB to collect more payments information. Now, in pursuing this goal, we knew already that extensive information about what we call the supply side of payments exists in some form or another. We get this from operating the SAMOS, which many of you know as SAMOS, which is a South African multiple option system, the core interbank payment real-time gross settlement system. We also receive data from other service providers. So data exists, but as many of you know that it's one thing to have data exist, it's another thing to have data in a particular form structure that's usable. Now, the study we're launching today, by contrast, is about the demand user side of the payment system. The users thereof, their choice of payments methods, including their preferences, level of awareness, usage, reasons for adoption, and barriers to entry. The study has two parts. The one is a survey of about 45 minutes that just over 3,000 people completed. We call this survey the Survey of Computer Payment Choice. In the second part of the study, about 4,600 respondents tracked their payment behavior and payment method usage over a 3-month period using actual payments in a set period of days. This we call the Diary of Consumer Payment Choice. Here, people documented, among other things, their preferred payment methods, the amount they paid, and what the payments were for. The two surveys were conducted nationwide between April and December last year. They were designed to complement each other. Indeed, these two survey approaches has also been adopted by other central banks, for instance, Australia, Poland, Sweden, and the United States. And we will hear more from Jamie McAndrews on how these have been used in the United States. Now, I don't want to steal Mavis' thunder as she will be walking us through the high-level results, but I was struck by several insights. And sometimes these insights are not a major revelation, earth-shattering. It's things you knew, but at least we provide some quantification to the insights. All this wouldn't be earth-shattering news to you, but I think that there's a formal method in which we provide quantification, and when we do this in the future, there'll be some ability to kind of check over a time how things have changed. Now, few things. Even though the usage of cash, what comes out, is not growing anymore, it obviously does, not surprisingly, remain the most popular payment method. Debit card usage, again, no surprise to you, is second, and credit card a distant third. And that's interesting why, for very good reason, though, it is a distant third. Now, while credit cards are mostly used by richer households, which you would expect, there's a gap between the reported usage in the two surveys. The consumer diaries show that credit card usage are much more frequent relative to the consumer payment choice. This seems to be explained by people using a family member's credit card. Perhaps you too are familiar with this phenomenon of family members using your credit card. I am very much with my daughters all the time. I use less of my credit card than my daughters. It is also interesting to see the detail of when people spend and what they buy. By number of transactions, the top three payment groups are groceries, transport, and data. And I'm sure that has changed dramatically. It would have been a very different story 10 years ago. The busiest payment days are Fridays and Saturdays, a major revelation. So the slowest are Tuesdays. I guess this sort of information really reminds me that it is in payments where central banks are most involved in people's everyday life, even though monetary policy and financial stability, which we spend a lot of time on, are topics that grab the headlines. Now, let me say a little bit about how economists and payment specialists can use information from the study in South Africa. Firstly, given SARB's role in the payment system, understanding consumer preferences for different payment methods will help us meet these diverse needs. Specifically, the study will help guide our implementation of our payments ecosystem modernization program and the digital payments roadmap. Secondly, the SARB and other regulatory authorities should be able to identify the possible misconceptions about some of the products. For instance, we see in the survey that the main reason people do not use debit cards is that they say they don't make enough money to qualify for a card. It seems that they think that the qualifying criteria are more stringent than what they really are. And that's kind of very important information. Given this sort of information, we can help educate people so they can make the more optimal choices, which will support our financial inclusion work. Third, we hope that external researchers will be able to make creative use of this information, all of you sitting here, to give a taste of what can be done with this data. Let me just give one example from a US paper that is based on survey data. The authors estimated the cost of adoption and usage of different payment instruments. They further estimated counterfactuals. What would happen, for instance, if banks were to impose a new fee on the use of debit cards because regulators, for example, that make debit cards more expensive to use? That question is a difficult question to generally answer, but armed with the survey data, the authors found answers. In this case, they determined that in the US, people would use more cash and checks in both the long and short run. Credit cards were not affected as much. It is surprising that such a change would lead to an increased use of paper instruments. The researchers also found that the burden of this change would fall much more on low income consumers. Once again, a useful, not surprising policy insight. I hope that we get some good papers and some good insights out of the survey. For the poor consultants who are struggling, I hope you make some money from the research. I shouldn't be saying that. To conclude, I would like to congratulate the cross-functional team led by the National Payments Department, the dedicated long hours to the study. I'm sure the team is relieved that the study is finally launched, and we will be repeating the surveys in the future. Thank you very much, and let me hand over again. Thank you very much. Should I go?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Thank you so much, DG Rashad. I am now going to call up Mavis Matwana, who will take us through some of the high-level insights provided by the report. Yes, DG is just stepping out to do a media interview. He will be back shortly, just in case you're wondering where he's going. But if he does come back up onto the panel, you know why. Yes, Mavis, over to you.
Okay, do I have a clicker? There. Good afternoon, fellow colleagues. I have been tasked with the pleasure of sharing some of the key insights, noting that as in the DG has already touched us on some of the interesting as an insights that as in he found as in the report, but I have the pleasure of delving a bit more into some of the information that as in we're able to gather from this study. So in my presentation today, I'll first start just by outlining why we actually embarked on this particular study, and what the ultimate as an objectives of why we will be repeating as in this particular study also on a periodic basis. I'll also just deep dive a bit into the methodology, noting that as in DG Cassim did do that, but I'll share just a bit much more detail of what essentially are the main different characteristics between these two survey instruments that we use to generate the insights that as in you will have the opportunity to actually go through the reports that will be published today. Then obviously I'll delve into some of the insights, and I say insights because once you get your hands on the report, you will note that it is about a 60 to 70 page long document. There is a summarized version for some of those who, through social media, we are aware that our attention span is no longer as it used to be. So there is a shorter version as well as a detailed version for the consultants, as DG Cassim mentioned. And then, of course, then I'll just close up with an overview of what were some of the key learnings for us as we embarked on this journey, and then what lies ahead. So where to from here? So just to maybe start off, we focused on a group of individuals that were 18 years and older for this particular research, and it was a nationwide research. And I think that is what is quite interesting as an about it. There is such rich data that we could only publish a 70-page document, but there is so much opportunity for us to generate as and further insights that zoom into the different provinces, the different racial groups, the different as in genders, the different age groups that we intend to put together and share with you in the coming periods. And as the DG indicated, we wanted really to get an insight into what is informing the use of the different payment methods. We do have the supply data, as indicated. We have SAMOS, we have payer returns. Some of you colleagues are aware of those. And they give us as in a high level or aggregated as in data for the most part of values and volumes. But we wanted as in to dive into the particular drivers as well as the factors of why there is usage of the different as in methods, how they are used, when they are used, and so on. And that's what as in we did with this particular study. And why is that? Why do we want to actually get this particular information from consumers? The first one actually is centered around the Vision 2025. In the Vision 2025, we have outlined a goal that deals with public accountability and transparency, and where we set out that we would like to now make visible more information about the national payment system, not only to you stakeholders, as some of you do have as an avenues where you are able to get information. However, there are those stakeholders as in who do not, who are not involved in several conversations that you are and are not privy to this type of information. So we wanted as in to just as in enrich that point. And then secondly, we wanted as in to really have trends that we could leverage on, one as a central bank, so that we are able to identify interventions that us having as in a catalyst role could implement with yourselves, of course, and then obviously there are those as in that we may have to implement with other policymakers or regulators. And then, of course, we hope that as in this information will also serve you, the payment service providers, with a view of what are some of the developments that are coming up so that you could make the necessary investments and enhancement to your product offerings. And more importantly, you could have insight into where maybe there are opportunities to elevate some of the consumer education or awareness initiatives that you have embarked on or you had not as in maybe really thought of that you may want to start as in thinking of. So we used 2 survey instruments, and these were coined in the US, and hence on the cross-functional group, we had as in a number of colleagues as in from the US who were part of this work in their jurisdiction. These particular 2 survey instruments are different, however, they complement each other in different ways. So the first one is called the Survey of Consumer Purchase Choice, the SCPC, and then the second one is the Diary of Consumer Purchase Choice. So I will here on start using as in the acronyms. So bear with me, the SCPC and the DCPC. So that is actually now common language amongst the cross-functional group who worked on this. The SCPC is more a recall methodology. So what it does is there is a questionnaire, and it is a 45 minutes questionnaire that asks questions around do you know about as an XYZ payment methods? How frequently do you use as an XYZ payment methods? Why do you use as in those payment methods? And it more lingers on the past sort of as in 12 months. So we say that as in the past 12 months, have you come across as in these particular payment methods? Why you use them? How often as in you use them? And so on. So, and the key benefit for this particular survey is the one that is able to draw out the drivers. So this enables us as in to get as in those motivations. The preference statements actually mainly arose out of the SCPC. So where you see statements saying that I do not know much about digital payment methods to use them, that information actually stemmed from the SCPC. We had about 3,068 respondents for this particular survey. And as I indicated, we needed to make that as a nationally representative, and we weighted that against the population base. The population base for 18 years and older is around 40.5 million per the 2022 census data. The DCPC, on the other hand, is a transaction-based collection of data. So this one, I actually had an interesting activity that I wanted to run as in with you, but as it so goes, technology failed us as in a bit because we wanted to give you a feel of what this actually survey entailed. But essentially, individuals who participated in this, and there was a total of 4,624, had to keep as in a diary. A diary is exactly that. If you think about those of us who were teenagers before, the current way of blogging and just sharing all about your life on social media, we kept a diary. So a diary is exactly that. Individuals needed to keep track of how they spend and what they spend on, how much, at what time, over a 3-day period. And they did this over 3 months. And they had to they completed about 11 diaries in that period. So you would wonder, how did we get this done? Who was willing to participate over 3 months? So we did as in have some through the research partner. So let me make it as in clear. Participants actually were not aware that they were participating in a South African Reserve Bank study. But we did at the onset through advice from the consultants as in were on the, the experts were on the cross-functional group, come up as in with some sort of an incentive. So which was stay within as in this 3-month cycle and you may get as in this. And we actually did indeed as in reward as in those people with the remuneratory package that as in was promised as in at the beginning. So that's how we sort of as in motivated the individuals to stay on course. And I think we are quite proud of that number. Generally, in other jurisdictions, that number stays around 3,000, but in our case, we're able to go over the 4,000. The key benefit, as I indicated, this particular one enables consumers to actually, the respondents to provide us as in with that day-to-day data, transaction data, and we are able as in to get a sense of when do they use the payment methods, how, why, and so on. We do just want to highlight as in that for this particular study, there was a limitation that we didn't use as in the same panel that was used as in on the SCPC. It was initially as in our goal, but for different reasons, we're not really as in able to. So, and that did lead as into some of the differences as in that you will see in terms of as in the data that has been published in the report. And I think we're able to indicate as in that. So that is one of the limitations that as in you see. So what are we picking up as in on a high level from the study? I do know that as in the DG has already reflected as in on these. However, first on the right-hand side, it's just as an indication as in of how the different as in payment methods that as in were grouped are utilized. So with cash, I think as in it's not a surprise, used as in 98% of the time. Debit cards used as in by 91% as in of our sample, and then credit cards 19%, and then the banking app is also as in gaining as in prominence. We do want to just as an indicate that one of the key insight that as in I think was a bit concerning, I would say as in to me, was that we did see that there is quite also a high cash usage amongst the youth. But I think we're able to analyze that a bit better to essentially, if you think about it, most of the youth, they're still then dependent as in on their parents, etc. So, and how they will receive funds is primarily as in through cash, if you think about it. So we do know that as in they're relying as in on cash, but the average values as in that they are carrying or using is around 168 Rand. Of course, the comment around most of payments are used on groceries, so that I think it's not really as in a surprise, but I think all across from cash to debit cards, most of the payments as in are used as in on groceries. The most prominent month where payments are used happens to be around month end, so between the 25th and the 4th of each month, with 48% of payments being made then. I think for me, this one was quite an interesting one to observe, because it also maybe speaks to the element of the importance of ensuring that as in the infrastructure that is enabled by the payment service providers. If you are aware as in where are the most common periods as in when payments as in take place, you are able to then as in invest in those operational resilience mechanisms to make sure that as in there's less disruptions, I think, during these particular periods. And then lastly, Fridays, Saturdays, and surprisingly Wednesdays, obviously are prominent days as in to make as in payments. So I recall in the conversations when we're analyzing this data, there was a comment about why there's a peak in Wednesday. And one of the colleagues has mentioned that maybe on Friday and Saturday one spends, and then you have some remorse between Sunday and Tuesday, and then you have to go and top up. But yeah, so we saw that, and it was a bit of an interesting as a statistic. So as I indicated, the report itself does go into the different methods, but for this particular discussion, we've only packaged as an insights into 3 of the payment methods because we thought it draws out as in some interesting information, even though some of them as in cement what we know, but they also are offering us opportunities to think about as in this is what we could do with this information. And from cash, notwithstanding that it is as in a prominent payment as a method, what was interesting as in to see was that one of the key channels to still access cash was ATMs. I highlight this because in a lot of areas, primarily your township and your rural areas, there's been a disinvestment in infrastructure in those areas. However, this is one of the key channels that is still relied on by people to actually withdraw. Secondly, there is this perceived sentiment that there are no hidden costs to cash. So that is as an influencing the use of cash. And second, and another point that as in we're seeing that as in is contributing to the use of cash is this perceived risk that consumers as in see with regard as in to digital payments. And interestingly, also enough, they still deem cash to be safe to use. So, which is another as in, whereas for me as in it was actually one of the elements that did convince me to start moving away from cash as in many years ago. I think as I stand now, I don't even have cash in my pocket, but some still perceive cash to be safe to use. When it comes to maybe as an opportunities for us as in to really process as a central bank, especially as having just recently outlined a digital payments roadmap, also having impact on the PEM program, which is really trying to as in get as in some traction in terms of adopting digital payments. We are seeing that as in those who do not want to use cash are citing a security risk. They are further also indicating that they do find that it's expensive to withdraw cash. And then lastly, that they are also saying that as in it is inconvenient to travel to go and access as in cash. When it comes to debit card, which is then as in second to cash, what as in we are also as in seeing as in here is that debit cards as in are mainly as in used as I would say that as in it is used as in for specific amounts or higher amounts where cash becomes impractical. And we say that because we've seen that as in the average value on cash was 208, and whereas we saw that as in on debit cards, the average value of payments is 768. So you do see that as in there's a switch point from as in cash to debit cards. And that is as in, I think, an avenue that as in we could really exploit as in to our favor if we could understand as in what informs as in that switch over. In terms of as in the other reasons as in why debit cards are being also preferred is that they are being found to be convenient. They are easy to get or easy to set up. And then it is also found that as in it is commonly accepted as a payment method for the most part. Insofar as the reasons why debit cards are not as in being used as in by the other part as in of the population, there was this sentiment that one has to qualify for a debit card. And then secondly, there is as in the perception that as in fees and service charges are quite high. And then of course I've spoken to the issue around infrastructure to either as an access obviously or use as in the debit cards. We pull sentiments as in around the banking app. So we saw an interesting phenomenon around the banking app in that most of the respondents indicated that they enrolled on banking apps in the past 4 years. And here there's a possibility that COVID-19 was an influence. And we are also then as in seeing that as much as there is 55% of the population are using as in the banking app, it's notable the transactions that they're using the banking app for. They're using as in the banking app for buying airtime, data, and so on, and not really as in utilizing as in that particular app for level of transactions that we really would want them as into. So I think there's an opportunity as in here to deep dive better, to deep dive what is the reason why banking apps are mainly just seen as for topping up your airtime and your data. But we also then are seeing that as in it is as in a quick payment methods as in to send money to family members. So it is used as in for family support as well. In terms of the reasons for not using as in this particular payment method, there is once again as in a perception or around as in cost or hidden cost that centers around as in banking apps. However, countering that is that the banking app is definitely seen as a convenience. That was one of the main prominent reasons that came up around this method. So with that, as in just summary view of the results, for us as in, we have been obviously in engagements in the NPSD around this, and so what do we do with this as an information? And for us, one of the key point that as in we have definitely identified is that this particular information comes at a quite opportune time, especially with the initiatives that as in we have kicked off. That the DG mentioned as an earlier. So we want to leverage as in this information, and I'll speak to just one of the components which you are maybe familiar with that stems from the roadmap, which speaks to the consumer education strategy. For us, this particular information will actually be being utilized as in by us to formulate the different programs in line with the different income groups, the different as in demographics. So it will be as in quite assisting us as we journey on with that particular piece of work. Of course, this is not as in the first and last study. So what we aim to do is to also build a time series. So we would like to sort of as in see how the adoption of movement of the different payment methods moves along on a periodic basis. And there's conversation points as in around as in how often as in we'll be conducting these studies. And then lastly, it was as an obviously the first study, so there were some key learning points around how the methodology was run and how the analytics as in around as in the studies as in were done. So we intend to obviously refine the questionnaires, the processes and that we utilize just to sort of as an enrich the data and make sure that it's relevant and it does as in bring you that key insights that you require. So with that point, that brings me as in then to the end as in of the insights. We have set up as in a dedicated engagement portal for you to be able to engage with us further when it comes to these results after you've perused obviously the detailed reports. And you can reach us on SARB payment study at resbank.co.za. I think some of you already started to do that because we already had socialized, I think dating back to 2022, that we've embarked on this piece of work. So some of you have been following up. When is the research report? When is the research report? So happy for you to engage with us further on that. That brings me to the end of the insights. I'll hand over back to Lindley. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mavis. I hope you took away a lot of detail and have some questions. I'd like to invite our panel, please, to come and join Mavis up on stage. Dr. McAndrews, Jan, and DG Cassim, please just take a seat. And now that they're comfortable, we'd again welcome some questions from the floor. If you have any queries, please shoot. And then also the Slido QR code if you would like to submit your questions in writing. But I see there's a question over there from that. Oh, there we go.
Hi, thanks. I need to make sure that I'm not presumptuous about some of the findings that didn't necessarily make it to the slides. My question to the panel was, it seems that you segmented or categorized the spend based on value. In other words, I had $1,000 and 32% gone towards groceries. I've got the hypothesis, or intuitively I know, if you try and segment it per transaction, in other words, how many payments I've made, transport almost inevitably would be top. In other words, taxi money, that type of thing. Did you guys also split it based on volume, not just value? Question.
I think we'll take a few questions. So if there's a gentleman over there, please go. And if you don't mind, just introduce yourselves before you ask the panel. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kumaran from the Banking Association. So kudos to the SARB for doing this. I think it's highly needed in terms of addressing some of our key policy needs and societal needs. The questions around data quality and around the way that we get this kind of information. I'll preface it with an example. during the 2016 US election, probably the most polled environment in the entire world was the United States. People got phone calls, I think it went into the hundreds of thousands, asking them whether they were going to vote for Trump or they were going to vote for Clinton. It led to a totally inaccurate prediction in that regard. And where I'm getting to is there's a thing they call social desirability bias that comes into data. When the questions were asked and people were recording the diaries, how did you normalize out transactions that people would not speak of? Buying drugs, taking money from mummy's wallet, money laundering, and these kinds of things. What was the method of normalizing that out of the overall data? Thanks.
Any more questions from the floor for now? Okay, I think our panel can kick off with those two. Jan, I think perhaps you want to start with the data normalization question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the questions. So surprisingly, in terms of the transactions that people recorded, that they what they spent money on, we had classifications in terms of what you spent money on, but there were also options for other, and there were some interesting transactions listed there. The point I also want to make about that is regarding the recording of cash. Is that cash I can give you 100 Rand, you can pay for something else or give it to someone else, and none of that would be recorded in a formal system. So there's a part of that which forms part of the dominance of cash, and how those we didn't measure in terms of you have a budget and what did you spend it on. We measured what did you spend it on and what was that value, and that cumulative is what we looked at. And I'm in part addressing your question as well, is that it wasn't in either of the studies was a case of if this was the money, how much did you spend on it? We had an indication in SCPC, and we measured it based on number of transactions versus value of transactions. So how many times and how much do you spend at each of those? So you get both components, and you can then use both as indicative from SCPC and then look at the transaction data in DCPC. I think that covers both if I'm good. Thank you.
May I just make one point regarding political polls versus these in-depth surveys? And Jan is a much greater expert than I am on this. But this survey was done face-to-face, and especially the diary over time, over a 3-month period of time, as Mavis pointed out, 11 sessions with people. Very in-depth, and the survey itself, the survey part of it also was like a 45-minute thing. In addition, the populations were very large, 3,000 and 4,600. Most political surveys have a very large standard error, and in addition, they have, I think everyone concludes they've been degraded over time because they have very low response rates, whereas this survey had extraordinarily high response rates. So a lot of the surprise in 2016, I'll just make a note, there was incorrect analysis of polls that had really wide standard errors. So the best analysis of that incident over time is that was well within the standard errors of the polls, and that all of us were wrong to assume that somehow they weren't within the standard errors of the polls at that time. But this method provides much higher quality responses than does a one-question political poll over either a phone or the internet.
Thank you to our panel. Any further questions from the floor? We have a question there.
Thanks, Gita from PASA. One that surprised me most in the data that's been presented so far is in a country with, we told 85% of people having bank accounts, 2/3, you said, Mavis, don't think they qualify for a debit card. So I guess the question to the panel, and particularly Dr. McAndrews, to you is, what else surprised you in this? And compared to other countries, where you've done these studies, where does South Africa look very different?
Mm-hmm.
And we have a question here, just in the front. Oh, thanks.
Just because it's a related question, whether the population of survey respondents included foreign nationals for whom current legislation prohibits accessing bank accounts if they don't have valid permits to be in the country, because that might have been interpreted to saying I can't access a debit card. Thanks.
Okay. All right, then perhaps we can start with you, Dr. McAndrews.
Thank you. Well, I think one of the surprising things to me was the predominance of debit card payments. I really thought that was notable. And the divergence, as Mavis pointed out, between the use of debit cards and credit cards. So I think that the usage of cash was not as big a surprise. The results on day of the week, time of month, and so on are fairly similar across countries, and follow typical patterns, I would say. But the debit cards are very widely used in South Africa across the population. So it wasn't, only limited to high-income populations, and that was, I thought, a reflection of course, there has to be the infrastructure around the whole geography, because this is true, across geographies and across income groups and demographic groups. So I was impressed with that.
And does anyone want to address the question of foreign nationals?
Yeah, I'll happy to take that. So in terms of the sample design, so from a SCPC point of view, it's a random selection process. So you start with random selection from StatsSA's enumerator area database, of which there are millions across the country, and that's basically demarcated areas within a suburb. It would be like a 3-4 block street block area, and the entire country is divided into those blocks. So you start your selection provincial, district, region, subplace, or main place, subplace, EA. So that's your route. And by applying that, obviously within every EA, you have your demographic specifications of it's predominantly a certain group and area in which they are, and you wanna get your distribution across those patterns. So there's standard operating processes with that. We, as a research agency, we used a similar method in terms of this approach than what, speaking about elections, in the 2019 elections, we used the same approach, and we were 1% out from our predictions versus the IEC's final publication of the vote. This year, we were 3.2% out on the final national polling versus voter numbers. So that's the principle which we used is the same.
Can I just add
Yeah,
something?
please.
Yeah, I want to say I would be very surprised if this study is biased by foreigners who don't have documentation in this country. This study is likely a mainstream study of people who are registered in this country. I think that if we want more information about people who are not documented, then I think we need to target, and that's the only way we'll get a sense of the behavior of undocumented people.
Absolutely.
I see a couple more questions from the room, if you don't mind, those two gentlemen at that table. And then I think we can ask some of the questions from Slido. Please go ahead.
So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you. This is Mpho Sadiki from Network International. I think, this is a great study, and and I appreciate that it's been shared with the wider community. I guess my question is more around cash, in that I think it's documented as the predominant method. What I want to understand is, did you go behind the details in terms of the number of times cash circulates, what is being used for, and the point you made earlier to say, if I give you 100 rand, you go and buy something, that very same person will have the 100 rand and then use it for something else. So is there details in the report that speaks to how much cash circulates and what's that approximate number of the sort of so-called informal payments ecosystem?
Should I ask?
Yes, please.
Okay. It's related to, I think, Vegan's question as well. I'm curious, there's lots and lots of data out there. So my first question was on data quality. I'm now very interested in how the data comes together to inform things. There's lots of data out there. Was there stratification against things like LSMs, different types of stores of value, access to credit? And the last one I'll specify a bit more precisely in terms of geographical location-based stratification. And the reason I'll go into that is because we talked about cash drawn at ATMs. However, with urbanization, with changes, with the introduction of banking products and things, people are less and less using remote ATMs. This is what we see in the banking sector. And they're more and more using ATMs inside of malls. And I'm curious if that level had been reached, or if it's possible to overlay this data now with other forms of data like LSM data and be able to get out the micro trends or the stratified trends for each of those groups. Because I don't think the big trend in South Africa, and this plays into the inequality argument, is going to be the same for all of the LSM groupings or other groupings in SA. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Who would like to start with Mpho's question, just around cash and the findings that came through?
Am I on? Okay. Maybe I'll give that one as an version and the colleagues can respond. So I think Mpho's question as to whether the study measured as in the circulation and the number of times as in the the payment method as it moves around, that we would not really have been able as in to do. So what we were certainly able to do is the element that you're asking around as to where that payment method is utilized. So we are able to, as we indicated, for example, with the prominent use of that payment method as in on groceries, we are able as in to see that is either being spent as in on school fees, on rent, etc. So that as in we're able as in to, but this particular as in study to understand that phenomenon of how that cash as in moves around. That is not as in one that we've really seen as in the other jurisdictions as well, but open as into as we refine further as in the coming years to see as in how can something like that as in be catered for.
Does anyone want to add?
If I may add to that, I think the way I visualized it as I worked through it is it's almost as if cash is the ocean. And there are some major rivers, which is the debit card side. And then as this is a benchmark study or inaugural study as a benchmark, it is seeing these other payments beginning to trickle in to that overall pool of transactions. And that is, therefore, moving forward, it would really be interesting to see how those other payment methods start almost taking share away from what cash is currently as the dominant payment method. And I think the challenge perhaps is we talk about a virtual card, and in some cases a virtual card you can also utilize through your banking app. Now, to the consumer, it would be, well, I used my banking app versus otherwise it could be known as a virtual card. So those are the kind of complications with, as these payment methods start gaining traction and how they are utilized and how the consumer perceives them to be what it is that they're used. And there are interesting transactions that came out of someone who used sending money, like a remittance type of transaction, to send money to her investor. And the investor would then invest the money in some platform. So those are the kind of dynamics that wouldn't really be the almost intuitive assumption from a policy or from a development angle in terms of what these different payment methods may be used for or how they are perceived to be what it is that I did. And I think so, as Mavis said, this was now the first time round. So now these kind of interesting developments start coming out, and I think that would be interesting to build that in and refine that, and perhaps.
Let me come in, and then I'll prod Jamie, because I think that we were very lucky to benefit from the Atlanta Fed's work on design of payment systems, and although different circumstances, still very relevant to us. Having spent many years of my life designing sample surveys in Statistics South Africa, particularly income and expenditure surveys, the question is, why do you want, we've got to moderate expectations, but also not entirely create studies that are not useful. Why do you want LSM? For what purpose? When you're doing an income and expenditure survey, it's very important that you understand how different income deciles, consumption structure, consumption basket looks different, low income deciles to high income deciles. That's the objective here. The question is, what is the objective of this study? And, you want broad trends about why different people use different payment instruments. How much of that is conditioned by their income status? How much of that is conditioned by where they happen to be, and so on? So I think that there are many other studies on all sorts of things, but we mustn't exaggerate what we think we can get from this study. And I'd like to prod Jamie to talk a bit about how this studies were used in the context of the US. Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you. And the US promulgated very similar studies, also with the exact same names, the Survey of Consumer Payment Choice and the Diary of Consumer Payment Choice, which are conducted now periodically at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. And the purpose is exactly the same as the purpose of these studies. And this is one of the things that I think is so impressive about this study is the data quality here. I think, please don't quote me on this, exceeds that of the United States, because the tremendous effort that was made to do in-person surveys with a very few number of respondents per survey personnel. It was just, very high quality. And the difference was that another difference between the surveys that are conducted in the United States is that all the questions were designed systemically for South Africa. It wasn't a copy and paste. Instead, various people on the cross-functional team, Jan, Shirley, who's in the audience here today, and went through and decided what are the questions that are appropriate for the population here. So, but again, as Deputy Governor Cassim points out, this study is and as Jan said, a benchmark for how many payments of different types are used by different populations in South Africa. And I think that information is a starting point for all sorts of things. I'll just mention one thing and then I'll pass it Mavis pointed out that the cash payments are of a certain size, 168 rand or something like that. And the debit card payments are like 700 rand. So one can infer, just from that information, one can begin to infer that there are different characteristics of those payments. And some of those questions were asked. For example, security with cash. As you're making larger and larger cash payments, you have to hold more and more cash in your pocket, and the security becomes more of an issue. So that reflects a cost of using cash that varies with the size of the payment that you're making. Debit card payments are more convenient for large payments. They're probably lower variable cost, to use a technical term, for debit cards for high payment values. And so this is an interesting relationship that, again, the industry can use when they are thinking about how to deploy payment systems that have different cost characteristics, different security characteristics. And we don't see the cost numbers in the survey, of course, but we see the result of everyone trying to decide what's the best payment to use in a particular case. And that gives us our overall results in the survey. And so one can make a lot of inferences, and along with, as Deputy Governor Cassim had pointed out in his remarks, economists have taken these data and applied further assumptions and economic models, and can recover then all sorts of information. Again, that's all predicated on the assumptions that one uses and so on. But the inferences that one can make from these data are quite vast, along with a lot of additional analytical work.
Thank you. I'm going to take, just given our time, 2 questions from the Slido panel, and then our team can close on out. We have a question here from Megan Brown. Were there no insights in terms of influence from the acceptance side of the transaction? For example, if sparsers prefer cash over card, was this asked? And then a second question from Anonymous was, did the survey look into drivers to switch between payments, for example, from card to digital or vice versa? So perhaps, Anne, you could kick us off with the question around the acceptance side of transactions.
Yeah, that's for particularly for the digital payment methods, that there were some points raised about that. Cash, obviously, everywhere accepted. Debit card, a little bit of that, but with the high utilization of the payment method, it is not so much of a constraint or a barrier to use. But in your more sophisticated digital payments, that started to show as a result. Just to give a perspective on volume, so we recorded 210,000 transactions, which represent over 100 million in value in the DCPC survey. So that gives you an idea of the volume that from which these averages were calculated. And for instance, if you look at the point around access, so when Mavis mentioned on banking apps, so the majority of transactions on a banking app is for top-up purposes, buying data or airtime. The average transaction is about, I think it was 130 Rand or something. And it's more than a quarter of all transactions used by the banking app. So there's accessibility because it's easy to quickly top up, but there's also the utilization of something that is incredibly sophisticated, that sits in your pocket, and the majority of transactions are used for something like that. So accessibility it's a two-way street in a way. understanding what it can be used for on the one hand versus consider it as an accessible and quickly method to be able to use. I don't know if any other comments on that.
And then would you like to take the question around the drivers to switch between payments? So, yeah, from card to digital and vice versa.
That was an interesting conversation which we had, because as the average cash payment is 208 Rand, debit card is 760. And then from there on, everything else, the average payment for all the other payment methods is over 1,000. So there's a switch value where cash is just no longer practical to do that. And I think intuitively, if you have cash, unlike Mavis and, well, me as well, I don't have cash in my wallet. But when you get to a toll and there's it's 300 Rand or whatever the case is, and you have 300 Rand, but you think, well, I've got this and I've got that for the rest, and I'm going to travel around. Let me hang on to the 300 because I can split that up in many other smaller transactions. Let me rather pay this by card. And so that behavior is most certainly there. But what it points out is that the overall study average is 529 Rand. So, and cash is 208. So the majority of transactions are cash. That's why your overall average is lower, even though other payments are over 1,000. So it gives you an idea of how many transactions of fairly small amount happens on a daily basis, and that systems and structures deal with volume, and in terms of actual value, there are obviously much fewer transactions of large value in terms of general household consumption patterns.
Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We have one more question from the floor. All right. I'll give you a quick question. Please keep it to questions, not statements, if you don't mind, so that our panel can interact with you.
It will not be a statement. Thank you. I think mine goes to Deputy Governor Cassim and Mema Khan. I think, how can we use the study for financial inclusion and literacy, especially for the unbanked and underbanked individuals and businesses? And also, what will be the role of the Reserve Bank in enabling this? Thank you.
Yeah, look, I think that I was asking Jamie a question before I came up. Said, if you were to be asked the question, what's the role of the central bank in payments? How do you answer it? And he had a very elegant answer, which I can't remember. But I think that, but I think that, it's a question I've asked myself quite a bit: is where exactly does the SARB play a role in the national payment system, other than its obvious role of a high-value RTGS through the interbank market in the SAMO system? And it's clear to me that in many central banks across the world, central banks have come to play very different roles. Some have been very actively involved in the payment system. Some have actually done what we think traditionally should be done by the private sector, like the PICs in Brazil. But I think that although our primary objective is to ensure that we have an efficient, safe payment system, in a country like South Africa, where there's so much of inequality, we cannot ignore the issue of inclusion. It's a very important agenda, and I think that our role is to kind of, facilitate in a light touch manner, sometimes use instruments in combination with the Financial Sector Conduct Authority, really find, through a study like this, why is it that people are still reliant on cash? How much easier would it be for someone to make transactions on their mobile phones? Everyone have many mobile phones. Cash is a problem. Getting to auto machines in many areas are a problem. So there is the question of financial inclusion about who's banked in this country, and there's a question of how can someone make an efficient payment system. And I think that both issues are on the agenda of the SARB. The reasons behind why people make particular choices, how if better education about debit cards may make life much easier for many people who are not using it, would be really kind of important. Understand why there's no acceptance of debit cards in some areas are the kind of things we should be playing an important role in. This is part of the study.
Thank you so much, DG, and I think we'll conclude on those last remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us here today, and thank you so much for your engagement and your questions for the panel. I've just been asked to extend a few thank yous in my closing remarks on behalf of Tim, who couldn't join us. The SARB is extremely excited that it could initiate this type of work given the exceeding need for such insights. We have for years now had access to data, but it's aggregated, and we've been able to see volumes and values, but for the first time we have better insight into what might be driving consumer sentiment around different payments methods. A study of this nature for central banks also allows us to see the trends and use them to better inform regulation and policy. And we hope for many of you sitting here, it will help you make better and more informed decisions around what investments to make in technologies and how better to drive consumer awareness and financial inclusion. We also hope that the public can use this data to, for themselves, make more informed choices around what channels they use and make better financial decisions for themselves. This study would not have been possible without a very dynamic cross-functional team who began preparatory work as far back as 2021. We'd just like to thank from our National Payments Department, Adonia Simango, Darren Chamberlain, Mavis Makwana, Mokatimi Molaudzi, Monique Reed from our Economic Research Division, Peter Machetsi from the NPSD, Thomas Beloy from the Currency Management Department, as well as Dr. McAndrews and Kevin Forrester from the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, and Shirley Jeffries from the Finmark Trust. The NPSD and the South African Reserve Bank look forward to engaging with you on this research, so please, Mavis has given you the email address. Come back to us with your thoughts, your queries, your questions, your ideas for how better to improve this research. I'll just read that email address for you one more time: sarb-paymentsstudy@resbank.co.za. You know where to find us. And with that, we're going to close proceedings for the day. Please do join us for refreshments outside in the foyer where you can ask more questions of our panel. Thank you so much for joining us today, everyone. Have a good day.